Let's start at the beginning. Except I don't know if this is the beginning. Because we're dealing with something that's probably a trilogy. It might even be a quadrology, is that the word? But I think three main components. There's a whole holism to this, a whole aspect to this that we're going to reach over time. But I just have to start one step at a time. This is the diet and health portion, I guess. So this is where I start by attacking the idea of CICO, C-I-C-O, calories in, calories out. It's such a mundane and trivial and traditionally mechanistic thing. That's one of the reasons I love to attack it, is because it is so very oversimplified. This all starts in 1996, 1998, somewhere in that time frame. First, I want to go back and talk a little bit about CICO itself. Calories in, calories out. The idea of a calorie. Calorie is a thermogenic, thermal energy unit of measure. It's a measure of heat energy in biology. Theoretically, it's also used in petroleum and other disciplines. It didn't actually start with human bodies, it started with other heat energy systems. But it got applied to humans. And this is in the 1870s through the early 20th century, 1919, through the post-First World War. So this started in the 1870s and continued until the 1920s, this early phase of calorie research. And a calorie is a unit of measure. It's a unit of heat measure. How much energy, heat, thermal energy, does it take to raise X amount of water, X amount of degrees? Basically, I think it's 1 milliliter, 1 degree is 1 calorie. Something like that. It might be 1 kilocalorie. I don't know. Because I don't really deal with metric by preference when I'm dealing with biology, because we need to deal with systems and hormones. So we start with the element of a calorie in industry, and it is applied to humans as industrial machines. Very literally, how this comes about is people researching how to produce the cheapest food to get the most efficient work out of industrial servants, employee populations, industrial servants. One of the big studies, how many brick layers can lay how many bricks in X amount of time per day with this number of calories. And at the same time, we're starting to discover things about vitamins and essential minerals, and eventually what come to be called the macronutrients, which are not. There's no such thing as a macronutrient. So, this is the basis of calories. And it's relatively stable with a given population that matches this one dude. There's one dude in a box, an Atwater box, and you measured the heat output of him going through his life with the X number of calories, the exact number of calories in, the heat that you detected out, and that was his calorie energy budget. Like, they literally didn't even measure excrement. So, this is the basis of this science. And it becomes very popular after the First World War because we have a single, simple, isolated variable measurement that we can use to simplify all things in life and make them rational and scientific. It's a religion. It's a religious concept, a religious precept. And in the 1920s, the most famous of all times diet books comes out. This lady comes out with this diet, how to maintain, how to achieve, how to become a flapper. The previous model of being able to have hips, breasts, some body fat, everything went completely away. The new model of health is to have as little body fat as is possible and to achieve the prepubescent boy figure of the flapper girl. Early 20s, late teens. Late teens. Flapper girl. No hips, no breasts, skinny face, thin arms, bony posture, and affect. So the way to achieve this and maintain this figure, is to count your calories rigorously and to restrict them, to certain levels. And the measurements and how you determine these levels, it's all very arbitrary. But if you are gaining weight, cut down on the calories. And if you are losing weight, you're doing fine. If you want to maintain your weight and you're losing, up the calories slightly. That's it. And we have been doing this since the 1920s with no changes at all. Calories in, calories out. From the very beginning, from the absolute very beginning, this did not work for the majority of people who used it. That's one of the things you have to understand. One of the reasons why this isn't just the way things work is because, it's not just the way things work. People did not succeed on this diet. People were constantly having to reduce their calories further or change what they were eating or do something different, and still lack of success. So this is very obvious. It's because calories in, calories out is missing something, or several somethings. Remember that this came out at a point in time in our history when we did not actually understand the function of insulin in fat storage. We had no concept of insulin as a fat storage hormone. The only thing we came up with early on in the first part of the 20th century was that insulin was required for diabetics to process carbohydrates. Diabetes used to be a wasting disease. You lacked insulin, therefore you could not process carbohydrates or fats or proteins, but there's some differences there. If you went to a high enough fat and protein diet, you could actually function with ketones. People did actually survive diabetes with a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. So, a wasting disease. Diabetes was initially a wasting disease. And the reason is because no matter how many calories you put in, you could not gain weight or make use of those calories. So calories in did not equal calories out. Absolute 100% refutation of the formula day one. Now, people will say, but this doesn't mean that CICO, calories in, calories out, is wrong, except in some extreme edge cases, rare cases. Well, that's just bullshit. It's a basic refutation. If you do not apply insulin in some fashion, in some reasonable quantity, then it doesn't matter how many calories you put in. Well, what if there's too much insulin? What happens then? What if the insulin is not balanced to the calories? What happens to the calories in the presence of insulin? What happens to them? All of these things have never been part of the nutritional science. They've never been part of things. We've never actually adopted a examination of this. Okay? I don't know how to describe it. So from day one, it's broken. Later on, we discovered that insulin is involved in driving fat storage. And then we find out that there's other hormones that have something to do with metabolism. So realize that leptin and ghrelin, the satiety and hunger hormones, were discovered probably after you were born. Mid to late 90s is what we're looking at for these. You might be very young and have grown up with them, but realize that I was an adult. I had already spent years of men's health magazines, workout magazines, military training, dealing with calories in, calories out. I was a full adult, fully programmed when these things were discovered. And they didn't hit my perception, mainstream literature, for, I don't know, almost a decade after that. There's a point in the late 90s where something did happen and started to hit my awareness. And we'll talk about that in a moment. First, I just want to come back to the calories in, calories out, because I just want to dispense with that. It has never been a good theory. It has never been an operable theory. It has been refuted from the very beginning. It has never worked. It doesn't work for 90% of the people. It doesn't work for 80% of the people. It's not a rule of thumb that if you just eat less and do more, you will lose weight. There are certain conditions in modern life where changing your eating and moving habits, regardless of any macros, so-called macros, regardless of that, just changing what you do and how you eat will have an effect, at least in the short term. That's bodies adapt to change. That's true. But it's not calories in, calories out. It's a modification of your hormonal functioning because you've changed your body system, your environment, your macrobiome, okay? Your body ecology. And we'll get to that several chapters later. Okay, so calories in, calories out has never worked. Good. That's a starting point. Mid-90s, late 90s, 96 to 98. There's a time frame here, and it goes up into the year 2000. This is the early phase of my diet experience, my research into, or my it didn't even start as research, my in-your-faceness about health and diet and wellness. So I have a severe case of something. Alternatively, it depends on which year it is or which doctor it is, but it's rapid airway disease, asthma, OCPD, whatever they call it. Something. My lungs don't like to work in certain environments. I also have many of the symptoms of something called Gulf War syndrome. I was in the military in the Middle East during the time frame, and I got all the shots, and we'll talk about my views on vaccinations on some other time. But yeah, I got all the shots. I have Gulf War syndrome. That's just how it goes. So at this point in time, in the 90s, I am in the emergency room because my lungs are trying to divorce my body, or oxygen's not getting into my blood, or whatever, a couple times a year. It goes up. Okay, and we'll talk about that. But a couple times a year, I'm having, I don't consider it that big a deal. But everyone else around me considers it to be a life-threatening oh my God, emergency room, stay in the hospital for a couple days on oxygen, kind of severe respiratory attack. A couple times a year, just life. Well, I don't want it to be that way. And there are things that make sense and things that don't make sense. I smoked at the time. Smoking's probably not a great idea. At the same time, I know people in their 70s who smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and can run. So how do we adjust for that? How do you adjust your theory for a consistent, significant number of outliers? This is going back to calories in, calories out, CICO, for just one moment. Your theory doesn't work if it doesn't work. You can't even call it a rule of thumb if it doesn't work for a lot of people. Okay, so I'm kind of harping on that because that's actually what I'm supposed to be writing or talking about right now. But I'm expanding, extending, going through history. How did you come to this idea that calories in, calories out doesn't work? Well, it's a bigger question, so I'm going to give you a bigger answer. Late 90s, I'm in the hospital periodically. I did smoke. One of the things that I noticed at that point in time is that having a cigarette often made it better. Temporary relief for long-term harm? Very probably. Okay, I'm not going to defend smoking in any way. But, at that particular point in time, I was working in a couple of restaurants, bartending, waiting tables at a high-end place. I could afford Nat Shermans. I used to buy them by the literal case, and I could smoke good. I smoked lights. I did not smoke harsh stuff. Whatever. As far as it goes, I was smoking something that was reasonable. I wasn't smoking menthols and cooking my brain. Often I would feel better having a cigarette. I did figure out why this was later on. At the time, I had some insights and some ideas. There was a relaxation and outdoorsness. There was a lot of stuff that went with it. I drank some, not as much as most of my coworkers. I was part of the industry, and the industry tends to drink a lot. There were industry nights, after hours, industry parties at certain bars, and I could hold my own, but I didn't drink all that much. I did notice that there were certain foods that I did not feel good eating. There were restaurants I could go to where I would have an asthma attack, and that was kind of like a clue, but it didn't really hit me hard until later. What was going on then is that one of my 4 part-time jobs was at a Borders bookstore. I helped run the children's department, which means I put away the porn books, because the same cart had the kids' books and the porn books, because it was part of sexuality, which was just part of that section. Don't ask me, but Borders is not around anymore, so maybe that has something to do with it. One of the books I ran into, someone was special ordering the book, a bunch of questions, was about IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. My first introduction to this, simultaneously with a girlfriend's mother mentioning issues with gut health, was this crazy self-published book that you had to order. It took 2 weeks to get in. I got to browse it before the customer picked it up because I handled the special order, because that's how things worked in the 90s. And it was amazing. This guy had undiagnosable, incurable, crazy diseases. Okay, stuff that you just could not deal with. You couldn't keep up. Diarrhea, malnutrition when he eats more appropriate rich foods like cheesy breads and stuff, everything. And vegetables aren't helping. More fiber is always the answer. More fiber made it worse. And he goes and he gets a fecal matter transplant. He goes out of the country to get someone else's poop put into his intestines. And he eats this, fancy, not fancy, but basically a whole foods elimination diet. No processed food. And he gets better. Just like, holy shit, he gets better because he got a poop transplant. Well, I'm looking at this, and the poop transplant part doesn't matter much to me, but there's this whole host of other things that he's got going on that is such a big deal, right? I don't have a whole lot of leakage at the time, diarrhea leakage, liquid, blood, whatever, but there is some. There's definitely parts of the time where I'm like, how do people deal with life when their butt hurts, right? But the asthma, the rashes. So I had rashes so bad that if I got into a rental car, my face would melt. We'll get to that. The worst part of that is in the early 2000s. But it was there. I could go into certain environments and I would just itch. I would get rashes. Well, all of this, we didn't have the common phrase autoimmune disorder for everything at the time. But all of this goes hand in hand with his IBS. So it's something that he's looking at as part of the problem. So I'm clued in on this. I'm looking at this and I'm like, well, this is something. There's something here. Same time, my girlfriend has a sister who's in the hospital dying. She's been sick all of her life. She's been in the hospital for the last 5 years. And she's getting ready to die. Her mother, who has been researching all of the medical literature for decades and has, this is remember, this is the 90s. She has a published Netscape bookmark, I guess we call it a blog now, webpage, that is just got thousands of papers and reports and links, and it's just amazing. Like, she has all of the data for everything. Well, she talks about how, she's talking to me, part of the problem is that the nutrients are not being absorbed by her elder daughter's intestines, but toxins are passing through the wall of the intestines. And so you can actually tell the malnourishment from anything that goes into the GI. So they're doing IVs with direct nutrients and all this stuff, right? And then this happens. This is the week that she dies. I'm there with the family when she dies. Very sad, very moving. It was very special to be a part of the whole thing, but it was a very intense set of moments for everybody, right? So this all happens, and then job number 3. So there's basically there's Fridays, there's a high-end Italian restaurant, there's the Borders, and there's a futon store. This is my set of jobs at the time. Well, the futon store. The owner of the futon store is jumping on the Atkins bandwagon. This is the late 90s. Atkins is just getting popular again. Now, he's an old golf nerd. Okay, he's a workout nerd. He used to do bicycling and jogging and stuff, but he likes golf. So he's an old PE guy. PE meaning physical education. It's an old thing. It used to be in schools. And he's decided that he wants to get better at golf, and he just picks up out of nowhere. I keep asking him, why did you start this? And he's like, no idea at all. He heard about it in the 70s. He knew about it in the 70s when he was in gyms and doing workouts and stuff. The Atkins diet. And he's like, you got to watch it a little bit, because there was all these rumors about all these people who were dying of protein starvation on the Atkins diet in the 70s because they were living off of protein shakes and egg whites. Like, all these people died, and so they tried to put Atkins in jail, and all this stuff is kind of bullshit. But it's not all bullshit. Some of it is urban myth. Some of it is based on real reports. Not necessarily reality, but real reports. There's a difference. Never trust the news. So he jumps on this, and I'm just like, okay, explain it. Now, note, I'm dating a vegetarian. while dating me, she becomes vegan. Okay. And her mental health is sketchy at best. She's a diagnosed schizophrenic. She's on a couple of drugs. And I loved her to death. I love everybody. I'm just like that. I really do. I was in love with her to death. But there were some... She threw a printer, like an HP LaserJet printer, at my head. Okay, she was not always all there or very well controlled, and I noticed that her condition did not improve as her diet got narrower. Now, it improved much when she met me because she was a Twinkie and Doritos vegetarian when she met me. I introduced her to things. She'd never had asparagus before she met me. You know, this is Pennsylvania. She'd never had a lot of vegetables before she met me. She didn't do salad. She didn't do stir fry. You know, I could do a tofu stir fry. I took her to ethnic stores, Asian supermarkets and stuff, and showed her what tofu was really like agadashi tofu. We would go to sushi bars, have agadashi tofu. That was like fantastic. That was a road trip thing we would do because she was vegetarian. I would have some fish. She was okay with fish at one point and then wasn't okay with fish and eggs. She saw blood clot in an egg one day and she went full vegan. And that's just poof. Went kind of downhill. So I'm dating the vegetarian girl who's in the process of going vegan as I'm talking to my boss. We lived upstairs from the shop, which was kind of funny. And he's telling me about the meat and the cheese and the eggs. And he's like, oh man, it was so good last night. I just fried up like 2 pounds of ground turkey and ate it with butter. And I'm just thinking to myself, that sounds delicious. I'm 27, 28 years old. I'm like, oh, hell yeah, I am so full of testosterone. It's not even funny. Aside from my girlfriend, I'm still mostly cougaring at the time. You know, getting the yoga ladies in their late 30s. And I'm just like, I'm really into this meat. So I look at it, and I buy the book. And I try it out. You know, my boss has lost 30 pounds at this point in time. He's not unfit, but he goes from, you know, he's wearing 30, he's 6 something, over 6 foot, 6'2", 6'3", like well over 6 foot. And he goes from like 38s to 34s on his pant size. He's playing golf every day. It's super fantastic. He's loving it. So I try it a little bit, and it turns out that it is absolutely fantastic. I feel like $1 million. I'm doing everything exactly according to the book, and then I move. I move for a startup. I'm going to work on the internet in the Virginias, and everything goes to hell. You know, the first thing we do when I get down there. Well, that was okay. Second thing I do when we get down there, after the sex, was Texas Roadhouse. Okay, so like my diet just went to complete shit. Everything was pizza parties and wings. You know, I was getting free wings because I could eat all the hot ones. There were all these places you could go at the time. You know, and then it's getting into 98, 99. You know, we're doing the .com thing. And yes, it was just as big a deal in the Beltway as it was in California, which I did. I did the California thing, and I went back to Virginia a few years later. So this moves around. And, you know, my health goes back and forth. But that first initial experience with the Atkins diet was so stellar. It sticks with me. It's going to stick with me later on. But first, apparently, I have to get sick.